Okay, I think we're going to make a start. It's really great to see so many people here. Thank you so much to everyone for tuning in. Welcome to this session on the future of work. This is part of the Rethinking Economics Summer Festival 2020. My name is Christine. I'm a trustee of Rethinking Economics. As most of you probably know, Rethinking Economics is an international network of students, academics and professionals who are campaigning for economic pluralism within the economics curriculum. We're really delighted to be joined today by Professor Liza Herzog, Dr. Amit Basole, Dalia Gebrial and Dr. Alex Soojung-Kim. And we'll be hearing from them in just a moment. About 45 minutes, we're going to be hearing contributions from the panelists, and then we're going to have 45 minutes for Q&A. So while the panelists are speaking, if there's anything that you'd like to ask them, you can put your questions in the chat box, but if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll also see there's a little box marked Q&A, and you should be able to put questions in there and also upvote other people's questions. So if someone else asks a question you'd like to see answered, you can vote for that, and we'll be able to see that, be more likely to be put forward to the panelists. The other thing just to say is that Dr. Basole does have to leave us a little bit early, so if you have questions specifically that you'd like him to address, maybe make that clear when you're putting them in the chat, and we can try and prioritize asking those first so that we get to them before he has to leave. So the future of work obviously is something that is on everyone's minds right now. The coronavirus economic crisis is first and foremost a crisis of work, where people physically can't go to work, and that's having all kinds of repercussions on our economies. But we already, in many ways, were facing a crisis of work before the pandemic started, as many of us know, in terms of the quality and the conditions of work, long-standing debates around the effects of automation, and all of those issues are still there. So we're really delighted to have such an expert panel that's going to help us unpack some of how these issues around work are unfolding during the pandemic, but also how they might continue to unfold in the future, and most importantly, what we can do about it. So first, I'd like to hand over to Professor Liza Herzog. Liza is from the Faculty of Philosophy at the University of Groningen. She's part of a team of academics advocating for democratizing firms and decommodifying work. I will put a link in a second in the chat to your website where you can find out more about that. And she's going to talk about the policy that's needed to achieve this. Over to you, Liza.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me at this panel, and I look forward to the discussions. So, as Kristen said, I'm not speaking here for myself, but for a whole group of people who launched the Work Manifesto, as we called it internally, in mid-May this year. The corona crisis has really shown how wrong the neoliberal assumptions about working people are. They don't need to be controlled. They work on their own, even when they're in home office. They are highly motivated to really work hard in that kind of crisis. And what also became really very clear to many people, I think especially to many privileged people, is to what extent we depend on other people doing other kind of work that really keeps our societies going. And all of us who are in academia or in other desk jobs really depend on these people doing the daily work of caring for others, transporting food and other stuff around, keeping our streets safe and clean, and so on. And the way in which our societies currently organize work is really not doing justice to the value that these people produce. And by just leaving everything to markets, we're really committing what I think is a huge injustice. So the manifesto makes three claims. The first is democratize, the second is decommodify, and the third is remediate. So I'll briefly talk about these and then the connection between all three of them. The first is democratize. Now, this is actually a very old and long-standing claim in the labor movement. Don't let democracy end at the factory door. If there are people who have power over others, they should be held democratically accountable. That holds for economic power just as much as for political power. Now, our political democracies are anything but perfect, and there's a lot that needs to be done to repair and improve our political democracies. But I would argue that our chances for doing so might be even better if we also manage to democratize work. And I'm from Germany. I'm from a country where work is, let's say, some work is relatively democratized. We have co-determination, we have work councils. So there are all kinds of mechanisms, and they work pretty well in practice. They are also not perfect, and they work more for privileged workers than for marginalized groups. But this is not a totally unrealistic utopia. This is something that can be introduced in other countries as well, and it would most likely also work, and it would work to the benefit of workers. The second claim in the manifesto is to decommodify. Take labor out of the only powers of the exclusive powers of markets. Now, that can take different forms. It means regulating labor markets, but the central proposal here is to also create additional public jobs through a job guarantee, which would mean that all workers who, for whatever reason, don't find a job in the private sector can go and work in the public sector. And those jobs, this should be a voluntary program at least minimum wage levels. Ideally, it would be combined with opportunities for further training, contacts in other industries, whatever. You can think about lots of ways in which this could be designed. And I think Amit is going to talk a little bit about how the job guarantee has worked in India later on. So this would be a massive shift in the way in which the power structures of labor markets currently function, because it would reduce the threat of unemployment, which has such an impact on the power relations between employers and employees. The third claim in the manifesto is remediate. And what we mean there is to restore our relationship with the natural environment, make sure we don't have too much CO2 emissions, make sure ecosystems are repaired, biodiversity is preserved, all these really urgent claims. Now, some people read the manifesto as saying, look, if you democratize work and decommodify it, then you'll automatically also get remediation with regard to environmental factors. And I think that's a little bit too easy, because when we look at the way in which unions in the countries where we still have unions, how they have positioned themselves, they were not always super environmentally friendly. But what you'd achieve is you'd take away the very short-term oriented, very profit-driven push of capital, which always pushes companies in a certain direction. And hopefully that would also help to implement better environmental politics. And I'm not saying that this could replace environmental policies and climate policies on the political level, but it would probably help to better align companies. And when you think about all the debates about automation, there is also an environmental aspect there which is often forgotten, namely all the energy it takes to run robots and algorithms and online sessions and so on, and how these compare to other models. So when we really think about the future of work, we need to take that into account as well. And then the question is, well, where do we want, what kind of collaboration between human beings and computers, robots, algorithms, and in the end, the question, of course, also is, where do we want to keep human labor, because the tasks at hand are such that they cannot be outsourced to machines. I think that's a bigger issue than it sometimes comes across in public debates about automation. So this was a big manifesto signed by many people from the humanities and social sciences. It was published in 30 countries worldwide. But what I want to emphasize is it was not only people from outside economics. There were also some really famous economists who signed up, Piketty and others. And this idea that work needs to be fundamentally rethought is really now being taken seriously also within economics. And I think that's a really important move. And I hope it will also reach students, because sometimes, you know, teaching can lag behind what's being discussed in research. But I think it's a fundamental question for the future of our societies. And I very much hope that we can have these debates, talk about what it means for different countries and different contexts, how we can collaborate on developing ideas, maybe helping start experiments and so on. So thanks again for having me, and I look forward to the other inputs in the discussion.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Lisa, and a model of brevity as well. So thank you very much for that. So next we're going to hear from Dr. Amit Basole. He's a faculty member at the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University in Bangalore. He's also the lead author of the report, The State of Working India 2019. And he's been involved in lobbying the Indian government for stronger emergency measures in terms of social security during the COVID crisis. So he's going to be talking to us a bit about some of the policy recommendations in that report and how the COVID crisis is playing out in terms of its impact on the workforce in India. Thanks very much, Amit.
Thanks, Christine. And thanks, Patty, also for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here. It's a wonderful thing you guys are doing, and I was really awestruck to see the number of days and the programs. And I only wish I could have attended, many of those. What I'm going to do, I have about 10 minutes, and I'm going to stick fairly closely to three probes that I was given. One was on the impact of COVID on Indian workers. The other was on specifically the employment guarantee program. And the third was when we talk about things like employment guarantee or universal basic services, the question of whether they're too expensive to afford usually comes up. And so how do we address those? But I'm going to try to also make a few more bigger remarks as well in this context. On the future of work, I'm afraid I won't have anything to say, at least in terms of the long-term future of work on things like automation and so on. Rather, I think at this point, we are very much concerned with the future of work, a few months from now or a year from now. So that's going to be the time frame. I will say, though, that as a teacher and as an academic, I wasn't ready for the future of work to arrive as soon as it did for me in the last few months. And I'm not sure I'm enjoying it too much. Okay. On the impact of COVID, so I'll be focusing on the lockdown, not on the disease or the pandemic, which really I'm not an expert on, but the containment measures which have been undertaken in India and indeed in many other countries have had, of course, severe economic consequences and fallout. So that's what I'm focusing on. There's two kind of big picture aspects of the Indian economy that one needs to understand to get a grip on what the fallout has been. The first is that structurally, the Indian economy is still very much in its sort of en route to a structural transformation, which is generally we study in development economics as the holy grail of development, right? Where you eliminate informal structures, you put in formal structures of work, firm sizes expand, and social protection increases, all of those things. The Indian economy is not there yet. It's a labor surplus economy with a high proportion of workers in informal employment, with very little job security, a lot of self-employment, and so on. So what that means is when you shut down the economy and prevent people from moving, instantly people's earnings disappear. There is no earning at all if you're a self-employed worker who operates their own business, or if you're a casual worker who works on daily wages, and so forth. Even regular salaried workers who get monthly wages, many of them do not have the kind of contracts that allow them to be paid through interruptions like this. So what happened in April was instantly a very large portion of the Indian workforce lost its employment and lost earnings. Many of them started also having to borrow simply to maintain their daily consumption needs. So this happened because of the high degree of informality and precarity, which has increased, as many of you will know, in the last 20, 30 years compared to before. So that was the first big picture point. The second big picture point is that the kind of growth that we have seen in the last 20 or 30 years, particularly the last 20 years, has been very lopsided in many ways. Inequality has, of course, increased, that everybody knows, but not only vertical inequality, but even horizontally, things haven't really improved as much as we thought they would with respect to gender, caste, and so on. So we still have very persistent occupational segregation and earnings disparities by caste, gender, and other social identities. Further, there is a regional dimension to the lopsidedness, so that we have a few urban growth poles, and then a very large part of the country that hasn't grown as fast, again, resulting in an increase in these inequalities, which translates into a very large number of workers having to migrate very far from their homes to undertake precarious work, which we all saw in India. If any of you are following news, in India, the Migrant Crisis, which was a really horrific humanitarian crisis where people had to walk or bicycle or do anything basically to get from their workplaces to their homes. Because instantly in their workplaces, there was nothing for them to do, no earnings, no way to pay rent or anything like that. And the assurances of government social protection were clearly not reliable enough. Now, I will talk about social protection in a few minutes, and it did reach in places, but the point was that people were not willing to put their faith in it for good reason and decided to take matters in their own hands and move. And of course, many of them died, and it was quite a bit of a mess in April and May. All of that happened again because of these regional disparities in the development model that has been followed, where very few cities have become huge attractors for people to find employment, and small towns and villages have not. Okay, so where do we go from here? In the short term, there are a few very, very clear things that need to be done. Some of them have been done, others we are hoping will be done. Immediate and much larger cash transfers are needed than has been done so far. Some have been done, but we have estimated in surveys, others have estimated that people have lost up to 50 to 70% of their monthly income for 2 months. If you want to make up even a fraction of that, the size of the cash transfer has to be much larger than it has been so far. There has to be an extension of food, subsidized food, which is the public distribution system, which is not yet completely portable and universal. So if you're living in a place where you're not registered, you don't get easy access to that food and so forth, that needs to change. There's a need to strengthen public works massively. This is the moment for public works, of course, with physical distancing guidelines and so forth to be followed. But we have a flagship rural employment guarantee program, which is really quite unique in the world. The government has increased its budget quite a bit this year, but much more is needed to be done. And an urban version of the program, which we have advocated for a while, is sorely needed. Now, this particular urban version, I'd like to speak just a minute on that. What we have in mind is that a lot of the cities, particularly smaller cities and towns, are severely deficient in public goods. And now I'm talking about not only local stuff like roads and sidewalks and so forth, but also community centers, health centers, also ability to clean up your water, clean up your air, and deliver the basic ecological services and commons that you need for quality of life. So an urban employment guarantee program, we think, really does all of these things. It delivers a safety net by giving people a public option. It pushes up wages, therefore by strengthening the bargaining power of workers. It creates public goods, and it also puts the focus back on urban local bodies, which really haven't received the kind of attention that village local bodies have in India. Right? And I can elaborate on that later. So these are all things that we think can be done immediately in a year. Right? Now, lastly, in my last few minutes, what's the long run picture? Now, obviously, it's a cliche to say that crisis is an opportunity, blah, blah, blah. So, I already said it again. It really is an opportunity to do some very, very basic thinking on the kind of economy that we want. And I'll make two simple points here. One, the Indian economy is severely supply side constrained with respect to public goods. Right? So we are talking about basic things like education and health, obviously, which have been invested over the years. We're talking about ecological services. We are talking about softer things like knowledge and collective action. Right? So what I mean by that is we simply haven't paid due attention to cultivating a public culture of innovation, of going to people who are actually doing the work of innovating every day. Right? Somebody mentioned, I think Liza mentioned in the beginning about how neoliberalism underestimates what workers can do. It's absolutely correct. And the skills discourse misses this point. It's all about people not knowing enough to adapt to what is coming and how we can deliver that to them. And much less about how can we build on what people know. So all of these things are kind of public goods that have either been overlooked, right, or underinvested in, and so on. So a range, and I can't emphasize, anybody who's visited India, I think, I don't need to tell them, can't emphasize the divergence between private goods and public goods that has happened in India in the last 20 years. Right? If you can afford it, you can buy whatever you want in the private market. But we really can't afford to have, apparently, a road that doesn't have potholes in it. Right? I mean, that road is going to lead to the best mall that you can buy, right? But it's still going to be full of potholes. So that kind of thing we've convinced ourselves over time that we can't afford proper public goods. And I think that's a very big tragedy in the development story. COVID really forces us to rethink that. How do we do that though? Right? And that's going to be my last point, that the fiscal structure in India is really over-centralized. And at the local level, we simply don't have the resources to put where we think they should go. So, and with the new goods and services tax regime, it's become even more centralized. So all the money has to go up first, and then it has to come down back again. And unless that really fundamentally changes, I think many of these priorities are not going to be addressed in the way that sustainable change requires them to be addressed. Last point. Do I have a minute, Christine? Yeah, okay. So last point. All of these are very big changes that are needed in the political economy of the country. How possible is this with the current global economic order? You always come up against this. Right? And some of that fiscal space issue really also goes back to this, because the reason governments don't want to spend because they don't want to be seen as deviating from their pre-committed targets, whether they are debt to GDP or their fiscal deficit. And the reason they don't want to do that is because they don't want to be punished by international capital leaving. So they feel hamstrung to spend on what they think, what they should be spending on. Now here there are two sides to this coin. I'm not going to resolve this debate here. One side is that there are serious constraints that the global economic rules pose on countries like India. We really don't have the room to experiment very widely without risking a lot of capital flight and macroeconomic consequences. The other viewpoint is that we have hamstrung ourselves. Danny Roderick is one of the people who's made this repeatedly in different writings, that developing countries actually have a lot more room to maneuver with trade policy, industrial policy, as well as other macroeconomic policies than they think they have. And I can't obviously go into that in any detail, but I'm happy to address that in questions. I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks so much, Amit. And just a reminder to everyone that Amit does have to leave us a little bit early. So if you've got questions for him, make sure that you're putting them in the Q&A or in the chat as quickly as possible. I'm sorry if I'm a bit, my toddler just started screaming in the background. So if the UK lockdown is anything to go by, the future of work is going to involve a lot of doing Zoom calls with small children running around. So anyway, hopefully you won't interrupt us again. So I'm going to go next to Dalia Gebrial. Dalia is a doctoral student at the London School of Economics, where her research focuses on race and gender in the platform economy, with a particular focus on the impact of platformization in sectors like transport, domestic work, and sex work. She also sits on the board of the Historical Materialism Journal, and she's recently contributed to and co-edited a volume on decolonizing the university. And she's going to talk a bit about the future of the gig economy, both during the COVID crisis and also beyond.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to all of you guys, and it's really good to see how many people are attending this. So yeah, I will just get started by talking about, what is the impact that coronavirus had on gig economy work. And I'm going to be talking largely from the perspective of the UK, because that's kind of the geography that I work in. It's the workers that I talk to on a regular basis. So, and I'm sure that, as is often the case, a lot of this will be maybe kind of specific to the UK, but will also resonate across many different spatial contexts. So as has kind of been touched on before, the coronavirus pandemic has really mainly just laid bare and intensified the issues that were already present. And this is no different with the gig economy. And this happened in multiple ways. I think in many ways, the coronavirus crisis brought to head a lot of contradictions that have been sort of corroding at the rights and the conditions of working class people across the world for a very long time. And these contradictions are to do with things like what work is and what the worker is and what the workplace is and what working time should be. So in the UK, at least, the coronavirus pandemic really made explicit which sectors are being gigified and who is doing that gig work. And as was mentioned earlier by Liza, a lot of our sort of very key urban infrastructural workforces, especially things like courier work, delivery work, care work, all these workers that, you know, more kind of middle class people rely on to go and do their own work as well, has been gigified. And so when our society was sort of stripped down to these bare essentials, we realized that a lot of what we rely on is done by gig workers. And these workers are in the UK often racialized. So they're either migrants or they're racial minorities. And this also is true for a lot of other, particularly major cities across the world, that a lot of gig work is done by migrant workers or workers that are otherwise racialized in a way that makes them a minority. And what we saw with this, with the consequences of the coronavirus pandemic, was that gig workers kept getting left out or sort of falling through the cracks of the already quite meager relief packages. So in the UK, the Rishi Sunak's coronavirus rescue package, for full-time sort of regular standard employees, they covered 80% of workers' wages. Whereas the initial package didn't even make reference to gig economy workers. And then after a lot of pushback and a lot of pressure by then Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, but also from the unions that represent these workers, we finally got a rescue package for gig workers and part-time workers that was shockingly out of touch with how a lot of these workers actually exist in reality and what their work is actually like. So it didn't include things like sick pay. It meant that workers had to calculate their average profit from gig work from the past 3 years, which for a lot of gig workers is just sort of not, is a very it's either impossible or it's a very bureaucratically complex process. And it doesn't factor in things like insurance costs and all of these different things that are at the heart of how a lot of these workers work. Simply put, it just didn't reflect how gig economy workers work. But that oversight was not something that was new to this government. It's not something that was new just to this particular crisis, but it was the culmination of decades of companies running roughshod over workers' rights through this process of gigification. And so basically in the particular areas that I look at, which is the platform economy, which is where digital economy and gig economy sort of intersects to make the platform economy, the wild success of companies like Deliveroo, Uber, TaskRabbit, these all rely on basically misnaming their workers as something other than workers. So they rely on, by legally and culturally defining their workers as something other than workers, they're able to circumvent traditional workers' rights or the hard-won victories of the labor movement. So that could mean, again, things like sick pay, things like union representation. So it's no surprise that when it came to the coronavirus pandemic and we needed this like broad infrastructure to sort of put a safety net under our workers, what was made fairly effective for sort of regularized employment basically just left a huge swathe of our workforce, the workers that ironically are in one breath called key workers and in another breath are not called workers at all. It left them completely vulnerable and without that safety net. And so a lot of them had to do work, even if they had symptoms, even if they were vulnerable, putting themselves and others at risk. Now, what's critical here as well is that these mechanisms of, for example, misclassifying workers, of breaking down rather than having, you get paid annually for a salary for a job, your work gets broken down into little tasks, some of which are paid, some of which aren't, the reliance on algorithmic management and things like that. These are things that have definitely been sort of piloted and started not necessarily started, but intensified and refined in the platform economy, but are now being distributed throughout the workforce. And Ursula Hughes did a really good report recently looking at how a lot of the techniques that were refined in the platform economy are being generalized to sectors that are not necessarily explicitly platformized. And So when it comes to actually, and I think it's really important here to be very clear about the distinction between the different terms that I'm using. So oftentimes digital work, platform work, and gig work are sort of interchanged, but they're not the same thing. Platform work, as I said before, is where the digital work and gig work meets. Gig work is something that predates digital work. Sex workers, domestic workers, these are all workforces that have run on a gig by gig basis. And when you look at digital work can range from, very, very highly paid, like fintech work, all the way to like a delivery rider. So platform work is really looking at the people who are doing gig work through a digital platform, which has its own kind of like particular dynamics. So when it comes to actually whether or not something like the platform economy or automation could lead, like, does it necessarily mean that we're looking at casualization of work, or is there a way that it can be harnessed for different means? Well, platformization is not something that necessarily happens as a self-contained process. Its agency as a process is often very heavily debated. But from my perspective, as someone that looks at like political economy and work, the agency of automation as its own process is something that's often overstated. So there's one universe in which, the automation of different working processes can lead to greater liberation from work, in which, automation is harnessed globally to sort of relieve us from the need for human beings to do particularly, the most dangerous and back-breaking or intensive labor, or just eliminate the need for human beings to engage with the whole labor process. It could involve sort of reevaluating our whole approach to work, and could be an avenue where we imagine a world in which people's lives aren't actually dominated by work, and work doesn't have this particular moral quality, and the purpose of life is actually something else. And that's something that I'm really excited to read about in Helen Hester and Nick Cernacek's book, which is coming up, which is called After Work, The Politics of Free Time. So it could open us up to having an entirely different way of running our economy, of running our society, where, the majority of people don't have to sell their labor power in order to survive, or, as is often increasingly the case, to sell their labor power to just about not survive, basically. But if we're sort of using the past as the best predictor of the present, this isn't really how things are going to go. There are actually multiple points at which technological development could have, and indeed should have, had this kind of effect of dramatically reducing working time, releasing more free time, making us less reliant on heavily exploited labor. And that's not what's happened. Instead, people are working more and more for less and less. There's absolutely no rational economic reason as to why people are working more than ever before, yet remain so dispossessed. And we could have made dramatically different decisions from a long way back. But that's because the political economy of our system and our models of ownership is not based on progressing towards liberation from these things. It's not progressing towards that principle of providing for everyone and, increasing the quality of life for everyone. It's built to progress towards the increasing concentration of wealth, of social and cultural power and enrichment in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And at the expense of more and more people. So who are having sort of more people competing for fewer resources or bondaged by debt. And so being very precariously tethered to work and therefore to accessing the means of life, which has an abundance of effects on the distribution of social and political power. So that's why instead we're seeing and will likely continue to see the harnessing of technology for these ends. So we see, for example, the automation of management in platforms in ways that make workers very precarious and disposable, where workers are plugged into an app and managed according to rating systems that are unaccountable. Their ability to work is governed entirely by an algorithm whose inner workings are completely concealed. And that dynamic doesn't just have economic impacts, it has crippling political and social impacts on the communities that rely on that kind of work to survive. And that's not to create a nostalgic view of the past. In fact, a lot of the workers I speak to actually like the fact that they don't have to deal with an in-person boss or navigating office dynamics that have really varying impacts based on your race and gender. But that doesn't mean that we're replacing it with something that makes those dynamics better. Often they're making them worse in a lot of different ways. And we're also seeing the threat of automation looming very heavily over workers in the global south, where the economy is sort of more centered around manufacturing and industry, where we could see up to 80% of people losing their jobs. And so entirely expelled from the system that distributes the means of life. And this idea of expulsion from the wage relation is covered really well by Saskia Sassin and Gargi Bhattacharya and other people like that. So yeah, so I think basically, you know, what should the political response here be? Should it be to insist that people do not lose these jobs, which are often backbreaking, physically and mentally destructive, for which people are paid below poverty wages? Obviously not. Instead, I would say there needs to be a fundamental rethinking of work and the role it plays in our economy. And the development of technological capability needs to be marshaled to these ends. And for me, that means that work should not be the means through which we are able to survive in a meaningful way. So I'm going to close that by talking about how a lot of the policy responses around the future of work, ironically, will not end up being about work itself, but about what society and life has to offer other than work, and what kinds of social and cultural shifts need to happen so that all people, and therefore all workers, have the kind of bargaining power that means they can define their own conditions. And the fact is that if we wanted to, we could harness technology to dramatically reduce the amount of work we need to do to provide a good standard of life for everyone. And Amit Basole talked about this, and when he talked about sort of public goods and thinking about that, the impact of having good public infrastructure on the power of workers to organize. So the question therefore becomes, what changes in society do we need in order to get there? It means shifting our ideology into one in which everyone has an inherent right to the means of life, and indeed to the means of a good life, where the enrichment and concentration of political power to a tiny minority is not our overall goal. And therefore, it's not necessary to find all these different ways to keep the masses of people dispossessed or in constant debt. And it's a beautifully simple and beautifully possible thing, yet it would require us pulling off one of the greatest and most profound revolutions that humankind has ever seen.
Wow, on that note, thanks very much, Dalia. And I think leads us on quite nicely to what our last speaker is going to talk about, hopefully. Dr. Alex Soojung-Kim Pang. Tripping over my words, it's that time of day. He's the author of 4 books, including Rest, Why You Get More Done When You Work Less, and Shorter, Work Better, Smarter and Less. And he's also the founder of Strategy and Rest, which is a consultancy devoted to helping companies and individuals harness the power of rest to shorten our work days. And he's a visiting scholar at Stanford University. And he's going to talk, I think, a bit about the case for a shorter working week and about how we might get there.
Yes, so thanks very much. And it turns out to be great to be the last speaker because everybody else has teed up a lot of sort of what I was going to talk about. And Dalia in particular made the argument that, you know, technology has opened up a possibility for working less, for reinventing work, but that for various reasons, we haven't used it that way. And really what I want to talk about today is a movement of companies that actually are making different kinds of decisions about sort of how to share the benefits of productivity, of automation, of technology, of remote work, and so forth. And at this point, I'm going to try sharing the screen and head to, and so what I'm interested in is companies that have moved to 4-day weeks. So these are companies that have moved to 4-day weeks or sometimes 6-hour or 5-hour days without cutting salaries or reducing productivity or alienating customers. And briefly, they show that it's possible to push back against the culture of overwork, to redesign the connections between work and engagement and passion, and to make work more sustainable for us all. And this is already a global movement. And in my book, Shorter, I talk about more than 100 companies all over the world. They're located in a variety of industries. Not surprisingly, plenty in creative services like this firm in London, but also restaurants and nursing homes and call centers. They're companies sometimes that are fully remote, but they're also factories that are in industrial neighborhoods. So how do they do it? Well, first of all, studies show that most knowledge-intensive companies lose about 2 hours a day of productive time to meetings and distractions and multitasking and bad processes. And companies that move to 4-day weeks change all this stuff, sort of eliminate this by making meetings shorter, using technology more mindfully, setting aside time in the day for focused work, and being more thoughtful about their tasks and processes. And by doing so, they find that that they're capable of doing 5 days worth of work in 4. Now, what are the benefits? For companies, it means improvements in processes and productivity and often higher profits. And for people, the 4-day week gives them better work-life balance. It gives them more control over their work. It, in effect, is an experiment in democratizing the workplace. It increases job satisfaction and it makes jobs more sustainable. So this is what I'm showing you right now is the results of a survey at one company in London. The month before they embarked on a 4-day week trial and 6 months after. And I've highlighted that the percentage of employees who describe themselves as being very happy at work go from 12% beforehand to just over 50% before. There are also improvements in work-life balance and ability to keep up with personal tasks. What I find really interesting is the bottom number can keep up with work. The number of people who say that they're able to get all their work done in a week goes from 50% to almost 80% at exactly the time when they are reducing the number of working days. So, I think that shows that this cycle that, first of all, there's an important psychological dimension to our experience of time, and that it's possible to not only give people back more hours in the day, but restore in them a greater sense of their ability to control their time in ways that improve their lives. Now, what effect has COVID had on this? Well, interestingly, companies that had moved to a 4-day week often report making the transition to remote work more easily. And companies that have moved to 4-day weeks, and there are companies that have moved to 4-day weeks during the pandemic. And they found that even under less than ideal circumstances, that making work virtual turns out to give people the chance to learn ways of working more productively. And in the companies that I wrote about in my latest book, there's a lot of experimenting with technology, rethinking collaboration, and redesigning daily schedules in order to make a 4-day week work. And companies that transitioned to remote work in the last few months have actually done all that. In effect, successfully navigating the lockdown gives you everything you need to move to a 4-day week. So this suggests that the 4-day week could become more widespread and more accessible in the future. And for one thing, we know that workplaces, especially open offices with their recirculating air, their tightly packed desks, their common spaces and surfaces, can be vectors for COVID, as was the case in the South Korean call center. The blue shows the seating locations of people who actually have contracted the coronavirus. And the 4-day week, combined with flexible and remote work, can help reduce density in the office and help workers and customers feel safer. We're also starting to see some interest in the 4-day week as a tool for stimulating greater productivity and greater leisure spending, for example, in restarting post-pandemic travel and tourism. Jacinda Ardern, Prime Minister of New Zealand, is but one of a number of politicians who've expressed interest in the 4-day week along these lines. Now, the state hasn't played a very big role in company adoptions yet, but they could be very useful in the future in helping resolve lots of policy issues around things like how you deal with benefits or vacation policy or the legal definition of full-time work, how you deal with overtime, things that often prove to be obstacles for companies in adopting a 4-day week. They could also play an important role as a systematizer. So creating regional systems in which government services and schools and businesses all run on 4-day weeks. And that would go a long way to making 4-day weeks more feasible and potentially drawing in new businesses to regions that sort of maybe want to sort of boost their growth. Now, finally, even if it isn't intended to move us toward like fully automated luxury communism, and in fact, companies that adopt 4-day weeks do so in response to very specific crises or systemic problems, right? They have recruitment and retention issues, they're facing founder burnout, they've got some other kind of problem. But the 4-day week, I think, prompts a rethink of how we draw the lines between work and time, the place of labor in our lives, and how the benefits of increased productivity and automation should be woven into the workplace and how those benefits can be shared. So thank you very much. That's what I had.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. And thanks very much to all of our panelists, and thank you for keeping to time as well. So we've got plenty of time for questions. I'm seeing there's loads of great questions that have been coming in on the Q&A. I'm doing my best to keep track of them and to try and ask as many as I can. As I said, I'm going to take a few questions that were specifically directed at Dr. Basole first, because I know that he's got to leave us first. So I think there were a couple of questions, I guess, about the macroeconomics of the Indian labour market. So a couple of people asking about, is there the potential for capital flights if some of the measures that you're advocating are adopted, especially given that India's competitiveness in sectors like the garment industry is predicated on exploitation and low wages. Is there a trade-off essentially between kind of maintaining levels of employment versus the quality of employment, or some of these other measures? Related to that, somebody asked, is there any chance we'll see a decline in the gig economy in India after the crisis? And then there were also a couple of questions, I think in different ways, about tech and digitalization. So somebody asking whether, considering the distribution of digital IDs in India, could fintech offer opportunities for the government in terms of decentralization and also in alternative finance mechanisms for people, particularly if the government doesn't implement income support measures? So I'll let you just take any of those as you would like. And then there are also some more general questions, I think, that it would be great to have Amit feed in on if he's still with us. So I'll ask some of those to the panelists more broadly after this, if that's okay.
Sure. So let me just take very quickly some of those questions. I might slip a few, so maybe, but let me try and get most of them. So on the capital flight, I actually saw the exchange on the Q&A. And what I had meant was something slightly different than what the person explained using the garment factory example. There it's the question of the race to the bottom and whether compromising on labor or environmental regulation is really the only way to compete in the global economy. Now, of course, there's a very long debate on this. And, again, we can't really go deep into this. But I think that this is not a question that can be answered really generally, in general. I think that if you have a sufficient, if you have a close look at certain industries and you have certain non-compromising values, and this is where really the political economy comes in, because the reason we always find environmental and labor angles to economize on is because those happen to be the ones which are the weakest in the current political economy. And if those constraints become stronger, then I have no doubt that capitalists will figure out some other ways to economize. Right? That much faith, I think, in capitalism all of us have, and I'm talking within the framework of capitalism. Obviously, I'm not for it, and I would love it if it were transcended, by the revolution that Dalia was talking about. But the point is that if there is a strong labor movement and there is a strong environmental movement, then one can figure out how to be competitive by increasing productivity and by doing those kinds of other supply side bottleneck thinking that I was talking about, right? whether you're talking about skills and education, whether you're talking about electricity, simple things like that, roads, all of these are supply side bottlenecks that make you uncompetitive. High wages are maybe one of 10 things. So if you're going for that first, it means you're going for the easiest thing. And the challenge today is to make that a harder thing to do. Now, of course, that does kick the ball a little further down the road. The question is, can there be a labor movement in one country in such a global economy? And of course, the answer is no, not without significant coordination across countries. It's not possible. Right? So we can go into that a little bit further. The other thing, what I meant about capital flight was really more the, the kind of short-term capital that that pays attention to what ratings agencies say. And ratings agencies look at what the fiscal deficit is. So in the short run, most of the time the government is scared to appear, quote unquote, profligate. It thinks that if I've said 3% of GDP and now I'm saying it's going to be 5%, then maybe ratings agencies will think, well, it might be 10%. What's to stop it from being, something a lot much larger, and so on. And that leads down a road where a lot of hot money flows out, right? And that is, of course, your problem because you allowed hot money to come in the first place. It's a problem that we've set us up for. We should not be having that much hot money coming in to balance the current account. And I don't have to go into that, don't have the time to go into that. But we've sort of hamstrung ourselves over there quite a bit more than we needed to. Very quickly on the question on, there's actually an interesting question there about income guarantee versus employment guarantee, which if you don't mind, I'll just pick up. And this is quite a hot debate everywhere. Should it be UBI? Should it be employment guarantee? Why not both? And so forth. So in a poor country context, if you're not going to do a universal income transfer, which most likely you're not, because universal is a very big word, and it gets you into all kinds of problems. You don't have the kind of monetary sovereignty that maybe the US has or something. You can't do it. You have to target it. And once you start targeting it, you run into all kinds of problems. Even if you had the Aadhaar system that that question was talking about, that enables you to do some targeting, but the real problem is how do you identify incomes correctly and how do you identify who deserves the transfer and so forth. The advantage of the employment guarantee is that it's self-selecting. One, it is the kind of work that most people will opt out of if they have other things to do. So it saves you the trouble of targeting it, and it creates public goods and assets, which a simple income transfer doesn't. So there are two big reasons why you might go with one or the other, but nothing to say that you can't go with both if you can do it properly. I don't think the gig economy is going away anywhere in the near future. What COVID probably will do is high touch industries are going to be in trouble. Not so much the high tech, but where you are up close in proximity with other people, with service delivery people and so forth, there will be changes there. But a lot of the gig economy is not really a high touch kind of economy, and I don't see that going away. Not only that, but the general principle of informalization and becoming precarious is a widely accepted principle now. So unless there's a big pushback, again, from a labor movement, there's really no other way to do this. We are going to see informalization. So those are my thoughts.
Great, thank you so much. And I think, yeah, Amit started to touch there on some of the questions that I was going to put to the panelists more generally in a minute. So what I wanted to first, as we go to sort of broader panel discussion on the questions, there were quite a few questions basically kind of asking people to elaborate on what we might expect to see happen in the future in labour markets. So particularly with regards to automation. So there was a question specifically for Liza saying, the debate about automation and job losses has been going on for a long time, like is now different, basically. And a question for Dalia about the consequences of automation and AI for gig economy workers. And there were also some questions more generally about, I guess, what we might expect to see happen after COVID in terms of the gig economy and some of the issues Amit started to talk about there. Are we likely to see growing market concentration, growing inequalities of power, and thus growing flexibilization and precariousness of work? And then a question on that about whether is there a silver lining? Could informal and flexible work catalyze the recovery? Which I guess maybe goes to some of these wider political economy questions that Amit was just discussing about whether there is a trade-off between how fast employment will rebound versus kind of employment protections and the quality of work. So there's quite a lot there. I think I'm just going to let the panelists pick up on whichever of those themes they would like to, if that's okay. And maybe go to Liza first, since it's the longest time since she spoke, and then I'll take the other panelists in their order.
Okay, thank you. Those are very big questions, of course. I often get this question, what will happen? And my standard reply, which I still stick to, is it depends on what we do and what we let happen. Now, of course, not we as single individuals, but you cannot predict the future because it depends on political decisions. And I mean, I'm sort of worried that the time window to make labor issues really, hot political issues high on the political agenda, which opened up at the beginning of the corona crisis, might already be closing down because people are settling into a kind of new normal, which is for many people much worse than before, but it feels like, okay, we can predict the next 10 days or so, so it's better than at the beginning of corona. And so there's really a question of what kind of political momentum can be built in different countries. I think we are in a phase where there are lots of very interesting experiments going on. I mean, the ones that Alex mentioned about shortening work time. And just to pick up briefly one that is related to the kind of work that Dalia is looking at, there is in the US a big movement of, not big, I mean, it depends, but growing fastly, let's say, of platform cooperativism. So platform work, but run as cooperatives, so that the employees also own the platforms, own the data, which is very important, and can make decisions collectively. So it's not as if we lacked models and ideas, but I think there's still not enough political pressure to really make these things salient for politicians. And I mean, on my pessimistic days, I think things have to get worse before they will get better. On my more optimistic days, I think that lots of people in more privileged positions will hopefully remember that lesson of how vulnerable they are and how much they depend on other people's work. And it's just not okay not to try to change the structures to improve the conditions, especially for marginalized workers in these very precarious positions. But there's no predetermined cause of things, like as if it was some kind of natural event. And is it going to be different than other times? Again, it depends on what we do with it. There's no cause of nature here. And I mean, some countries have been sort of successful in harnessing technology to get to 35 hours per week and to have pretty generous wages and so on. So the post-war years in a country like Sweden or France, I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was taking advantage of technology to create pretty widespread, not wealth, but well-being was definitely better than in many other countries. And so I think that's where we need to go again. And it happens on all levels, political, also in companies, and ideological. I think the ideological is really one of the biggest things here, because it's the excuse for people who don't want these changes to say, oh, it can't be done. And if that's broken, then lots of things become possible. So I'll stop here.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Can I go to Dalia next?
Yeah, I completely agree with with a lot of what Lisa just said. I think that a lot of the time we think about things like automation and stuff like that as being these very top-down processes, employers or, capital and the state bring in these changes and impose them down. And, there's kind of a plan for how these things go. But historically, and it will continue to be the case, that what ends up happening will always be an outcome of struggle between labor and capital. I also do worry that, at the beginning of lockdown, I think we had a really, really interesting conversation about work and about how do we value work? How do we socially and economically value what different kinds of work and who does what different kinds of work? And I think that it's actually, not a coincidence that in the midst of the pandemics, where we saw some of the most intense or like geographically dispersed mobilizations happening, particularly in the global north around Black Lives Matter protests, which, is inevitably going to be related to work and workers' rights, especially in these kind of platform work fields. I think that sometimes that kind of massive pause on everything was maybe the space that was needed in order to kind of bring these, the combination of pause and crisis was maybe what was needed in a sense in order to kind of start to have these conversations. And I think that is why we are seeing this absolute desperation to go back to normal, like this desperation to return, like with the governments in the UK saying, it is your nationalist, your patriotic duty to go shopping, because we need to like get the ball back rolling. We need to fill people's time, because this amount of free time that people are having, and the fact that people are realizing that for a lot of them, although not for the kind of key workers, but for a lot of people, being able to set their own hours at work and at home means that they're actually realizing that a lot of their jobs can be done in a lot shorter space of time. And that kind of abundance of free time was leading to some politically subversive conversations. And that's where we're seeing this sort of engineered return to normal, even though it is not any safer to return to normal than it was at the beginning of lockdown. Nothing inherent about the virus has changed. But I think that was very much a political decision to kind of like stop the space that was being created. And I worry about the similar things with Lisa as well, that this sense of, are we kind of losing that moment? When for me, a lot of my work looks at the relationship between immigrants' rights and workers' rights, and how so much of the remit of workers' rights in a lot of these platformized industries is actually really a question of migrants' rights, and it's actually really a question of what migrants of varying statuses are having to be forced to do because of the way that the migration system situates them very precariously. And at the beginning there was this real moment where it was sort of like the government was almost shamed about the way that they'd been treating migrants, and the way that, especially this whole narrative around like skills-based, point-based immigration, how, social care and elderly care work and a lot of frontline work was being classified as low skilled. And there was a conversation there happening. And, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, was pushed to basically grant new visas automatically to health and care workers. But after the dust settled on that, we saw another iteration of an immigration bill going through that is bringing us towards a points-based system, which is basically going to hurt the most low-waged workers, not because they're not going to be able to come, but because when they come to the UK, they're going to be classified as undocumented, and therefore a range of exploitative things they'll be mired in a range of exploitations and basically made invisible in the eyes of regulatory standards. So I think that, but at the same time, the pandemic isn't over. So there's still a lot of sense that we don't know what is yet to come. And we should always be aware that oftentimes it is crises like this that in which, the scripts of a different way of doing things can possibly be written.
Thanks. I was going to go to Alex next, but I know that we are losing Amit in 5 minutes, I think. So just wanted to give Amit quickly an opportunity to come back briefly on any of the things that have just been discussed, and then I'll go to Alex. And I'm hoping I will have time to fit in 2 more rounds of questions after that, if the panelists can keep their answers fairly concise.
Thanks, Christine. Actually, there's only one other, I think I was looking through again on the Q&A, and there's a couple of questions which are more specifically to do with Kashmir and employment. So I'm not sure, it's sort of, not sure exactly what the question is, but I think it relates to how, after the recent actions of the Indian government to change the political status of the state of Kashmir, which is now made into a union territory, what do economic policies sort of mean, or what does employment mean? And I don't really have much to say on it, but I just wanted to, first of all, just say that is exactly the kind of question that will get buried now with this COVID crisis, this was a big issue last year, and there were so many big issues in India last year. If some of you are following that, COVID has conveniently wiped out many of those things in a very cynical take, I have to say. But this is a big problem. And recently this was brought to my attention because, in Kashmir, after the government changed its status, internet services were shut down for a long time. And then they basically never moved to 4G or whatever the fast thing is, right? They're on 2G or something like that, which means in this entire time when things have been shut down, all of us have been at home working with the internet and so forth. This has been a big problem for students to study, for people to find work. All of these things which require the internet nowadays hasn't been happening in the same way. So that's all really I have to say about it. It's a kind of a question where the politics is completely intertwined in what's happening. So the economic policy is not easy to really talk about. But that's the only thing I had, and I'll probably sign off in a few minutes. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. And I hope that all of you who asked questions felt that your questions are being answered. I'm doing my best. There's quite a lot coming in. So I'm going to go to Alex on these issues that the other panelists have just been talking about around what we might expect to see happen next. And then we're going to take another couple of rounds of questions.
Sure. I mean, I think first of all that the things that are likely to endure no matter what are that, first off, remote work is out, is the cat that's gotten out of the bag, right? There were plenty of managers or companies that before the pandemic said that, remote work is the hill we will die on. It will never be possible here. Who have, in relatively quick order, seen that their workers under rather difficult circumstances, while also simultaneously becoming, bakers and homeschoolers, have shown that actually it can work. And, I think that this does, it does raise the stakes for sort of explaining why it is that workplaces should go back to normal. And I think it sort of does put a stake in the ground for, or a foundation upon which it is possible to start building something new. I think that, the one tiny silver lining in, the very likely, second wave of the pandemic is that companies are going to have to continue to think through how they can essentially become more resilient, more flexible, how they can encourage that in their in their workforces, whether they are considered essential workers, who are sort of compensated as a consequence of that, essential workers who we applaud but then make disposable, or or with whom they have some other kind of arrangement. And so my hope is, and so I think that what that suggests is that the need for sort of redesigning workplaces and and changing work will, that pressure isn't going to ease up, right? This is not just the changes will not come just from a kind of early flush of enthusiasm, music in the cafes at night and revolution in the air, as Bob Dylan put it, but rather there are going to continue to be problems that companies, that sort of labor, that policymakers will continue to have to solve, and that this will continue to keep pressure on everybody to experiment with things like better remote working systems, sort of flexible work that is, that doesn't unintentionally discriminate against working mothers, for example, and things like shorter work weeks. So that's where I'm at.
Great, thank you, Alex. So we've got about 20 minutes left. As I said, I'm going to try and fit in 2 more rounds of questions. So if panelists can keep their answers to maybe sort of 2 to 3 minutes each, then we should be able to do that. So firstly, there's a couple of questions that have come in that that I think are about sort of intersectionality or the impact of these issues on different kind of groups of workers throughout the world. So there's one about women, the feminization of labor, and the argument that women are sort of particularly vulnerable to exploitation in the workplace, or are more likely to be suffering from low pay, poor conditions, and how we can make sure that a politics about ideas like a 4-day week or job guarantees, income guarantees, is working for women and is correcting gender injustices and imbalances that already exist in the labour market. And then we also had a question from somebody in Vietnam asking whether some of the debates that we're having about the future of work sort of come from a vantage point of sort of urban Western labour markets where lots of people work in office jobs, and the whole discussion about people now working from home and etc. And how relevant that is, I suppose, to non-Western, non-urban settings where a high proportion of people work in agriculture and manufacturing, and how we can talk about these issues in a way that is relevant to and is speaking to people in those kind of economies as well. So I'm just going to take those now and give the panelists an opportunity to respond. And then there's also some questions about the whole sort of automation post-work, which we'll take separately in a minute, but I think it's important to treat these kind of, specifically these questions, I guess, about how can we have a politics about the future of work that is intersectional in these ways, I think is what these questions are asking in different ways. So maybe I'll take the same, well, we do still have Amit. I don't know if you would like to say anything on that, Amit, or if you literally imminently have to leave.
Well, I have to say that it's been so interesting that I keep wanting to go, but I want to keep listening, so I'm pushing my bedtime. But I guess the only question, the third world kind of thing, the global south question, I think that's an important one, because it's true, a lot of the future of work discussion is coming out from the global north, and of course, therefore, naturally is responding to considerations there. Now, what makes it really difficult to discuss it in the global south context is the sheer heterogeneity that we have here. And maybe you have it there too. I don't know. I live here, so I see it here. That we have jobs that are going to be directly impacted by fourth industrial revolution technologies, for sure, right? And that's going to be a big thing, because we've specialized in these low-end IT service jobs over the last 20 years or so, many of which are going to be easily automatable and will be automated. And we are not even just talking about simple code, changing code or something. We're talking about more sophisticated things like copy editing and so forth. Right? So a lot of these kinds of skilled jobs that the service sector in India has been doing are definitely going to be affected by very cutting edge AI and fourth industrial revolution technologies. But then your question, the question poser is also correct, that for India, about 45% of the workforce is still in agriculture. Right? So that's a very large number of people in agriculture. So where are they going to go? What is their future of work? And are we going to see that kind of manufacturing and then services trajectory, that has been sold to us as the template for any economy to increase its per capita income? Or can we imagine different ways? I for one, definitely think there can be other ways. Per capita income has to be increased. India is not at the place where we can only talk about redistribution, because it's a low middle income country. It needs to increase productivity and income. It needs to move its workforce into other activities, but then what are they going to be? And all the while, people who have already in the tertiary sector and doing these kinds of jobs, which are taken over by automation, what are they then going to do? So we have two very different kinds of challenges here, and I think many developing countries are in the same boat. So did we miss the manufacturing bus? And if so, was it just as well because we had to get off it, soon anyway? So why bother getting on? Is there a different way of doing it? These are all great questions, I think, for students, to think about, because they are the questions of the next 10 or 20 years in developing countries. So that's all I'll say.
Great. Thank you so much, Amit, and thank you for delaying your bedtime to stay with us. We appreciate it. Lisa, can I go to you next with those two questions?
I'm not sure I have so much to add. I think the intersectional questions are going to be continuous struggles, because the same lines of privilege and disadvantage are going to show up again and again. And I mean, one challenge that has often been discussed is that if the people who write the programs, set the algorithms to work, are from a very homogeneous group of people, then they might not have the sensitivity to understand the impact of these technologies on vulnerable people in society. And on the global South question, I totally agree that there's a lot of heterogeneity, but even in an economy like Germany, I think at the high point, there were still about at least 35% of people not working online. And we also have lots of jobs that will not be digitalized so soon. And there are all kinds of questions about the vulnerabilities of these workers. But I think the bigger questions for our economies is the supply chains, and whether we can, as customers, as academics, whatever, we can try to put pressure on companies about their supply chains and what they do in other parts of the world, because there's a lot of stuff that people would not like to see, because if they saw it, they would have to feel guilty and take responsibility. And there is now discussion about a supply chain law, but it's sort of, it's not clear whether it will come at all, and it's only looking at basic human rights, not labor rights. I mean, it's unclear how far it would actually go. It would be a nice starting point. But I think those are really important questions. And the question about, how can we build alliances between the labor movements in different countries, that's a key question for the future.
Thank you, Lisa. Dalia, you next.
Yeah, so this is kind of an area that a lot of my work is sort of focused on, which is basically that when you look at a lot of the academic and the sort of journalist literature with platform, when, gig economy, platform economy is a very sort of sexy topic. Lots of people kind of, especially when you're looking at sort of like mainstream media, like to talk about it, but also this problem exists in the academic literature as well, which is that the worker is, two things happen. The worker is treated as a kind of de-raced, degendered, sort of taken for granted citizen subject. So it's treated as a sort of a blank space, really. And therefore, often by default, that often means that assumptions that are more shaped around, how citizen white men live and act and move throughout public space and have access to different kinds of resources, that is taken for granted as the social position of workers in the platform economy. You also have a situation whereby things are abstracted. So like we're abstracting from like the way that things are at the moment to like our theory of platform economy, without looking at the particular conditions through which those realities are made the case. So a lot of my work looks at basically thinking about, when we look at platform work, who comprises the majority of platform workers, and how does that shape what platform work is looking like? So we know, and I've sort of mentioned this before, that platform workers are largely migrants. They're also often actually women. So like a lot of the platform economy sort of language or like discourse happens a lot around like Uber and Deliveroo, but actually I think the last data I saw, and it was that 55% of platform workers are actually women. So actually the impact of these platforms on sort of work models that were already more gig-like. So things like sex work, domestic work, and care work, that these sectors have been like very, very, were some of the first to be platformized and have been very, and it means that a lot of platform workers are women. So looking at that reality of the fact that so many of these workers are migrants or racially minoritized, so they might be like technically citizens, or they might have, regular migrant status, but they are still racialized in a way that makes in a marginalized way, that has very concrete impacts on how the platform economy and platform work is manifesting. And so when we look, we mustn't abstract workers' rights from those broader social and political rights. So a lot of my work looks at how, if we are going to, empower like platform workers, there's a lot to look at with sort of platform cooperatives and the legal structures around platform work and the models of ownership around platform work. But a lot of it is also actually just looking at what are the grounded conditions of the workers that do this work, and how does that shape what they need to change about their work and how that work is manifesting. So I think that is like a really, really important question, and I think that is something that a lot of the academic literature kind of fails to do. Like, it will often say, oh yes, a lot of these workers are migrants, but it will be kind of like a footnote, as if it's incidental, when it's absolutely not incidental. It is the platform economy is shaped by and shapes migrant workforces in so many of these major cities. And in terms of the question of the Global South, I think I read the question, and I think what it seemed to be saying was that in the Global South, a lot of the jobs aren't bullshit jobs. So what do you do when, like, it's really easy to talk about how, like, do we need another, like, you know, PR company? Probably not. But it's like, but what about when your job is actually like really integral to like the reproduction of life, which is what agriculture, etc. is. And I think that that's a really important question, because that's not just the case in the Global South, but also the platformization of work. The sectors that are platformized in the Global North also tend to be these jobs that aren't bullshit jobs. Like, it's not a bullshit job to, you know, have like, you know, domestic work is not a bullshit job. Care work is not a bullshit job. It's a very real job. It's undervalued, but that doesn't mean that it's not very, very, you know, integral to our lives. So I think that is why this question of, you know, the work that is integral to the reproduction of life, how do we ensure that work is equally is distributed well across the society, and is also, of course, valued socially, politically, economically. And that will then mean that we won't see this kind of like hyper concentration around, you know, I actually think that like it's a lot, the question, you know, even though when we talk about what kind of jobs can be cut and what kind of work can be reduced, we often think about the kind of more that, you know, what Braber says, calls bullshit jobs. But actually for me, it's really, really more central on that work that is integral to the reproduction of life, and so is often necessary but like resented, or necessary but undervalued. That's really for me where the most important, because that's like the key at the heart of the question. So I think it's very, very relevant still for these kinds of roles like agriculture as well.
Thanks so much, Dalia. Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of the politics of work in the UK, it really feels like lockdown has focused people's minds on what is socially necessary work and what is not. So thanks very much for articulating that so clearly. Alex, I think you are still to come in on this round of questions, so please go ahead.
Great. Very briefly, sort of, let me speak to the gender and work sort of dimension particularly. And I think I've seen three interesting things with with companies that have moved to 4-day weeks. And one of them is, obviously, this allows for better work-life balance and kind of management of sort of work and family sort of obligations, et cetera, which makes it easier for a certain segment of working parents to to remain in jobs full time. A second thing that happens is the disappearance of what sociologists of work call the flexibility stigma, right? The often unintentional devaluing of work by people who are working part-time or working some from home, because they've there is this enduring sense that if you're really committed to your work and you're good, you're gonna you work 12 hours a day and sleep under your desk and always be available. People who don't conform to that are treated, even in companies where there are formal policies to encourage remote work, with a certain degree of suspicion, while people who work flexibly find that they have to do additional labor in order to remain visible to their colleagues, remembered by their bosses, essentially do a whole bunch of coordination work so that their flexibility does not end up inconveniencing the system. In contrast, when you have everybody working shorter work weeks, the person who is working fewer than 40 hours has no stigma whatsoever, because everybody is doing this. Furthermore, because everyone is doing it together, because it is a collective action, it becomes something that sort of better links people together rather than serves as a source of discord within workplaces. And then finally, there's a really interesting thing that happens to labor markets when you move to a 4-day week, which is that, as one founder put it, when I started this company, I was hiring 25-year-old guys who didn't own any plants, right? You wanted people who sort of you knew could work really long hours and essentially had no life. In contrast, in companies that move to 4-day weeks, what they're looking for are people who are really, really good, often a little ruthless about organizing their time, who know how to work well with other people, who can prioritize and execute, who can focus on a particular task, get it done, and then move on to the next thing. What that ends up doing is sort of nudging companies to be more interested in hiring parents, in particular working moms, who are seen as having those kinds of qualities. And we know that there is a challenge with working mothers trying to get back into the workforce after they take a break for raising kids for a few years, coming back into either the same profession at the same level that they had previously. And what happens when you shorten working hours is effectively parenthood goes from being something that, for which the market charges a penalty to being something for which the market offers a premium. And this is a really interesting consequence of sort of the shorter work week. So, and then the global South stuff, though it's difficult to come up with a statement that's, that will be true for, for work across lots of boundaries, except, maybe, when you raise wages, people, you get more people who are willing to do a certain kind of work. But, so I think point taken. So thanks.
Thank you, Alex. It's abundantly clear that I am not going to fit in an extra round of questions at this point. So I'm very, very sorry to anyone whose question didn't get answered. The panelists all just had too much great stuff to say. And I do want to finish on time because I'm sure you all have places to be. We've covered such a huge amount of ground in that discussion, from questions about what kind of work is socially necessary, whether our goal is to guarantee everybody work or to free everybody from work, what would an economy look like where we weren't all dependent on work, what will the impacts be of the crisis on things like automation and precariousness in the labour market, and how that affects different groups. So I hope that you have got some food for thought and can continue those conversations yourselves, in your own universities or at home. I'm sorry that we haven't got twice as long to chew over it all, because I'm burning with questions that I want to abuse my chair's privilege and ask the panelists, but I've resisted that temptation, and I think we are basically out of time now. So only remains for me to say thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you to you for joining in. And I think Paddy has just flagged in the chat a survey that Rethinking Economics is doing about COVID and economics. So if you have 2 minutes to fill that in after the session, that would be great. Thank you so much.